U.S. President Joe Biden in the courtyard of Vilnius University at the conclusion of a NATO summit, where he delivered a keynote address in which he he addressed himself first to the Lithuanian people and their break with the Soviet Union. Then to Vladimir Putin, saying the NATO and Ukraine will not waver. And finally, to the wider world, talking about the need for a rules-based order and a planet that works together on the key issues that go well beyond the fight that's going on in Ukraine, which has, of course, dominated that NATO summit that concluded a short while ago in Vilnius. Joe Biden throwing down the gauntlet to a Vladimir Putin, further isolated by a NATO summit that strengthens the alliance at Russia's border, a summit that came in the wake of wavering inside Putin's Ukraine campaign. We'll ask about that speech by Joe Biden that you just heard. His next stop after Vilnius, which is new NATO member Finland, and the reset between Biden and an old acquaintance, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, clearly pivoting away from Moscow and towards the West. What's behind Turkey lifting its objections to Sweden's entry into the alliance? What consequences for the Black Sea, where the Ankara-brokered grain export deal is set to expire between Russia and Ukraine? And finally, what options now for Vladimir Putin, who throughout the summit has kept up a steady regime of rocket attacks on Ukrainian cities, with a wartime economy in Russia and still plenty of customers for its natural riches. Can Putin outlast the West in a war that's far, very far from over? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking what next for NATO after this summit. Joining us from Madrid, he's former director of policy planning for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Fabrice Potier, CEO of policy consultants Rasmussen Global. Thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon.
From Washington, Melinda Herring, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank's Eurasia Center. Good to see you.
Great. Thanks to you for having me.
From Istanbul, Borzo Dargahi, international correspondent for the Independent newspaper. Thanks for joining us, Borzo.
It's my pleasure, always.
And Yves Bertoncini, vice president of the European Movement International Consultancy.
Thank you for the invitation.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, in the courtyard of Vilnius University, Joe Biden directly addressing Vladimir Putin in that keynote speech.
When Putin and his craven lust for land and power unleashed his brutal war on Ukraine, he was betting NATO would break apart. He was betting NATO would break. He thought our unity would shatter at the first testing. He thought democratic leaders would be weak, but he thought wrong. Faced with the threat,
Fabrice Potier, those are the words of an old Cold Warrior. He spent half a century in Washington, Joe Biden. The language, is it just standard language that he uses in each speech, or is this time a little different?
No, I think he likes to have this kind of more personal address to Putin. And his line is actually not fundamentally new, is to say the democratic world has held the shock of Putin's second invasion of Ukraine. And not only it has held, but it has actually proven quite strong and resolute. So I don't think there's something new, but I think when you say Biden is a Cold Warrior, I remember having worked with him for a couple of years on disinformation and foreign interference as part of the Transatlantic Commission. And he was very mindful of, for example, nuclear escalation. He explained us that when he was a junior senator, he actually asked the US government to send him to a laboratory to understand how you build a nuclear bomb, to understand how terrible that thing was. And I think whenever he says, you know, he doesn't want the US and NATO to be engaged in the Third World War, he doesn't want nuclear war, I think it comes a lot from that kind of reluctance of the old Cold Warrior, who actually is very reluctant to control escalation and to engage in escalation.
And that's, I guess, Melinda Herring, part of what the Ukrainians are a little bit impatient about. They don't like this balancing act between the fear of further escalation. They want NATO to be all in right now.
Francois, they wanted an invitation. So I think there was a lot of disingenuous rhetoric. I heard it from the president, and I also heard it from his, I also heard it from his national security advisor. Yesterday or today, Jake Sullivan said that if we were to bring Ukraine into NATO now, it would mean an immediate war with Russia. And that's nonsense. The issue that was at stake at NATO was whether NATO would invite Ukraine simply to join. It was a question of an invitation, not a question of war. So I would push back on the Biden administration in how
just to
they're
be clear on that point, Melinda,
in Lithuania.
then what you're saying is that this Article 5, an attack against one is an attack against all, wouldn't apply because simply it would just be the opening of the candidacy, the roadmap to membership.
That's exactly right. I'm so sorry about my voice, Francois, but look, it takes a long time to get into NATO. So there's one big good thing that came out of the document yesterday. NATO decided to remove something called MAP, the Membership Action Plan, and that is a lot of detailed conditions. So the NATO said once Ukraine joins, it will not have to meet these specific conditions. So it will be faster. But NATO as a body refused to specify when Ukraine would be invited, simply invited. And that's why the Ukrainians were so frustrated yesterday.
And why did they do that?
So the Germans and the Americans are the holdouts. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just finish up. Fabrice Potier, go ahead. One at a time. Fabrice, go ahead.
No, I wanted to amplify what Melinda is saying, that I think there is a deep reluctance among two of the major allies, the US and Germany. And it's a bit like the EU. When France and Germany agree, things can go forward. When France and Germany do not agree, things are stuck. And at NATO, when US and Germany agree to actually not decide, it's very hard to move the needle. And fundamentally, what is disturbing, and I think what provokes President Zelensky's frustration, is that they're still, I think, hesitating on the whether. This is what Melinda is saying. Vilnius was meant to be about the when and the how, whilst actually what you saw in the communique between the lines is doubts about whether Ukraine should indeed join anytime soon. And this doubt is coming
from why,
from Moscow.
Again, explain to us, Fabrice, explain to us why this hesitation. If it's just simply a roadmap, I mean, God knows the European Union has kicked Turkey's candidacy down the road for decades now. A roadmap doesn't mean you're entering tomorrow. Why won't they commit to a roadmap?
I would say there are two factors. One is this old, I would say, assumptions, Cold War assumptions that, or even post-Cold War mindsets like Chancellor Scholz, that somehow we need to work with Russia. And it's inconceivable that we're completely closing the door to some form of strategic relationship with Russia. And obviously, having Ukraine joining NATO is a way to, in a way, close that door, because we're opening fully the door to Ukraine, which is seen by Russia as actually should not be part of the West. That's one thing. And second, I think there's this concern that Ukraine is indeed not ready, that there will be some kind of, it will trigger some provocation. And I think these are excuses to actually delay what is fundamentally an obvious decision, which is that Ukraine now is part and parcel of Euro-Atlantic security. So the question is better in or better out? And obviously it's better in. Even Henry Kissinger, who is not known to be a big friend of Ukraine, is agreeing with that assumption.
Yves Bertoncini, what's going on here? Shouldn't it be the French the ones objecting to Ukraine? But they're not. Emmanuel Macron's not objecting. It's the Germans and the Americans.
Yeah, but the Russian aggression of Ukraine was a game changer for NATO, for the EU, and for France as well. And so now we're witnessing the consequences of the.
But why is France ahead of the
changes.
curve on this when it comes to Germany and the US?
I believe France had a lot has committed a lot of mistakes, including after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. France has been suspected for long to be closer to Moscow, which is true, and you can refer to General de Gaulle. And it's a way first to counterbalance Germany's influence in Europe and also to counterbalance US influence in Europe. So the old Franco-Russian relation, the problem of Mr. Macron is that he tried to have an open strategy with Putin before the invasion of Ukraine, but also after. Now he understood, and in particular with this speech in Bratislava, that to regain influence in Europe, and in particular in Central and West and Eastern Europe, he needed to be even clearer as regard Ukraine accession to the EU first, and then Ukraine accession to NATO, while knowing that in any case it will be only an invitation and that will not happen overnight. So I would say it was a strategic shift and a tactical coup by Emmanuel Macron, and I back what he did. But, it doesn't change the situation. The situation is that Ukraine is de facto playing a role, a NATO-like role vis-à-vis Moscow. So that is important today because they are fighting against Moscow on the ground. We, as Europeans and as NATO members, we're trying to help them. And if I may add a last point, what shocks me that we focus on what has not happened in this summit. I would like to add that, yes, Vilnius is north of Ukraine, but Vilnius has also been chosen because it's south of Sweden and Finland. And today what we have witnessed is the fact that the Baltic Sea, with the accession of Sweden and Finland, has turned to, let's say, a NATO lake. Because if you look at the Baltic Sea, and that is the consequence of Mr. Putin's aggression, now, apart from St. Petersburg region and Kaliningrad, you only have NATO members around the Baltic Sea, so it has been transformed into a NATO lake. So I know that the situation is a bit more complex. We'll talk about the Black Sea, but the Baltic Sea, and that is the result, and we will remember this. And just as you know that, I mean, Finland was neutral back to World War II, and for Sweden, because that has been decided yesterday, well, it was back to the Napoleon Wars two centuries ago. So this is a major shift. As for Ukraine, it will happen. But what is more important today is what happens on the ground, the way we can support Ukraine.
Well, let's turn to our fellow reporter, Borzu Dargahi. Borzu, what's the lead on this summit?
That's a really tough question to ask someone like me. I guess the lead is that, these former Soviet states are really taking a lead role in NATO at this point. You know, you've had mention of the venue in Lithuania. You've had several mentions already about how Ukraine is playing a lead role in European security already. And what we haven't talked about is the leading role right now that Poland, Romania are playing in logistics for the Ukraine war and so on. And so really, the sort of shift in power towards the east, Germany left behind, basically clinging really almost in a kind of robotic, automatic, unthinking way to this old idea of détente, going back to like Willy Brandt times, unwilling to give up on the worldview that it has had for a long time.
Aren't you being a bit harsh? I mean, Borzu, they're pledging the Germans to overhaul their military. They're spending like they've never done before since World War II.
Every step of the way. No, seriously, it's been, at the very last minute they come along to get along in this whole process. They've been, kind of maybe just a few steps ahead of Hungary and Turkey in terms of, kind of getting in line with the new reality. This just refusal to understand and to counter what has been happening, the power and entrenchment of the entire Hanover network of German politicians and their ties to Kremlin and Russian energy and so on. And so, yeah, it's been very tough for Germany to get along, and they've been pulled along, obviously, by countries like Lithuania and Poland.
Fabrice Potier, have we underreported the fact that there's going to be, for instance, this training of Ukrainian F-16 pilots in Romania and Denmark, the fact that there are more commitments coming in here and there for long-range missiles. I guess with a summit like this one, the real question is, what are they talking about behind closed doors?
Listen, I think a NATO summit is not a Ramstein meeting. It's obviously very important to provide the kind of weapon systems and capabilities that Ukraine need to prosecute this counteroffensive and hopefully come to a point of victory and success. However, what a NATO summit is about much more than weapons and pledges. It's about political commitment. That's the one thing where I think everybody was expecting the NATO leaders to be. And on that count, I say, and I share President Zelensky's frustration that they have not given that clarity of commitment, which was not, again, about inviting, as of today, Ukraine to join, but was about saying we're going to start working on the path to joining the alliance. We're going to start defining the parameters under which joining the alliance is actually credible and feasible from an Article 5 point of view. And that, I think, they fell short.
So, Melinda Herring, how is Vladimir Putin viewing this summit?
So he's not very happy. Yesterday, he bombed grain silos in the Black Sea when the NATO summit started. There was also a G7 declaration on security guarantees that came out, and Russia's already condemning that. So Putin is unhappy, but I think the big question is, how will we remember Vilnius? And I think that we will remember Vilnius as expanding the membership of NATO. We now have Sweden and Finland. But I think we will also remember it as a big disappointment that the alliance didn't move forward on Ukraine. But there is a chance, no one has said this yet, but all eyes are on the Washington summit next July. And I think there will be intense pressure on Berlin and Washington to change their views on NATO's eventual membership, or on Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO.
Even if next July is smack in the middle of campaigning for a presidential election in the United States.
Absolutely. I think the Ukrainian American community is very, very upset with President Biden. I expect them to flex their muscles more and say, look, President Biden, you can't take us for granted. We expect to see a real invitation. I expect many Europeans to be pushing as well. I expect Ukraine to push as well. So yes, in spite of a presidential election, and I think Biden is also very, I think he's sensitive to the legacy argument. So if the argument is made correctly, if the Ukrainian American community flexes its muscles, I think Biden could flip.
Borzo Daragahi, having grown up in Chicago, where there's a sizable Ukrainian American community, they're also isolationists not too far away when you look beyond the city limits.
It's not just Chicago is more well known for its Polish community as well, which are also very much putting pressure on this. But look, you made a good point. How is this going to affect the election campaign? Yes, the Ukrainian American, Polish American communities could try to punish Biden. They tend, sadly for them, not to be in swing states, so it's not going to matter that much. But more importantly than that, are you going to go with a Biden who at least is 100% committed to defeating Russia and defending Ukraine, even if you may disagree with some of his methods? Or are you going to go with a Trump or a DeSantis, who are they basically are very possibly having pursuing Kremlin aims, sadly, I don't know if it's going to get me in trouble to say that, but very, very, very ambivalent and ambiguous how much support they actually have for the Ukraine effort, and how beholden they are to, various extreme right and extreme left tanky types who are more sympathetic to Putin. So choice between Biden and really, any of the MAGA type Republican candidates out there, and they're going to have to go with Biden.
All right, Yves Bertoncini mentioning the point that you have the summit, which will be remembered for it being the first for Finland, the one where Turkey lifted its objections to Sweden's membership. Speaking of Turkey, suddenly they're inseparable. Joe Biden and Recep Tayyip Erdogan side by side earlier as they greeted Ukraine's president on day 2 in Vilnius, the U.S. and Turkish leaders. They sat down on Tuesday, just after Washington had committed to pushing F-16 fighter jets for Ankara. Congress has to approve that. And just as Biden, again, kicks off that 2024 re-election bid.
We are starting a new process. This new process consists of a 5-year period for me, and now you are getting prepared for the forthcoming elections. And with the forthcoming elections, I would also like to take this opportunity to wish you the best of luck.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I look forward to meeting with you the next 5 years.
Yves Bertoncini, your thoughts on that exchange and on the role that Erdogan is playing, this pivot towards the West.
Yes. Well, basically, since it's just about geography. First, Turkey was in NATO because it was decisive during the Cold War vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, and now it's even more important given the war in Ukraine. Having said this, Erdogan had a first move in his diplomacy, which was a very pro-European, including accession to the EU, pro-NATO. And then now, you've mentioned the pivot, yes, he has a more, let's say, transactional position. He tries to bargain with Moscow, with Washington, with Germany, with France, depending on the context, depending on his personal and domestic interest. What is key is that he moved for Sweden. He obtained things. I mean, the delivery of F-16, which was blocked up until now. We'll see. I mean, for me, what is most important now is it's an expression we use in France, is ally, but non-aligned. So even less aligned than France. He has been aggressive vis-à-vis Greece, which is another NATO member. But what is key now is his role in the region, in the Black Sea in particular, and the way, for example, around the grain embargo or non-embargo, I mean the grain arrangement.
Which expires in a few days.
Yes, the way he could use his role, including vis-à-vis Russia, to say, look, we the Turks, member of NATO, we decide to secure the ways to deliver and to export grains from Ukraine and Russia. And if you, the Russians, you block this, we could retaliate. This will be absolutely key in the next few days and weeks. But we'll see. At least during this summit, and together with Biden, he wanted to show, if not loyalty, at least he wanted to show that he can be a constructive member of this alliance.
It sounds like more than just showing clean hands. Borzu Dargahi, at his closing press conference, Recep Tayyip Erdogan said he's still willing to broker eventual peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Yes, he said that a final approval of Sweden's entry into the bloc won't happen until the fall. But he didn't have to give those 5 Azov brigade commanders, allow them to go free with Volodymyr Zelensky, breaking a deal he'd made when they were sent to Turkey after the fall of Mariupol. Clearly, he's pivoting.
Have to be careful with Erdogan. It's a very personalized system. It could just be he's in a. I'm sorry to say this. I don't mean to sound blithe, but maybe he's in a certain mood one day, and in the system that he has built, that matters. I would also say that many people in the West misinterpreted what they described as a Turkish pivot to Russia. Turkey had to start dealing with Russia because of Syria. The Putin regime kind of backed him into a corner on the issue of Syria. There's issues of security and refugees and so on involved. And then, you have to count, count into the equation, the whole issue of the Wagner uprising and just how weak Putin looks right now. Erdogan likely sees an opportunity. Erdogan sees an opportunity to put Putin in his place after the many attempts that Putin has tried to put Erdogan in his place. And that is, one layer of it. Another layer of it is no matter what Erdogan does or says, no matter what happens in geopolitics, Turkey's heart is with Ukraine. There is the entire history of the Tatar Crimeans. There is a lot of sympathy among Turks. In their heart is with Ukraine. It always will be with Ukraine. And if you look at the weapons flows from Turkey to Ukraine, you look at the collaborations between the Ukraine arms industry and Turkey, you'll see that there is a kind of budding strategic partnership that has been forming between these two countries since the 90s that will continue to expand. And Russia is more a kind of variable in Turkish foreign policy.
All right, earlier in the conversation, Fabrice Potier is saying how before defense, NATO summits are about politics. And Erdogan, he is reelected. And speaking of fresh mandates, we saw images of old foes that were all smiles that also recently reelected. Kyriakos Mitsotakis of Greece sitting down on the sidelines of the Lithuania summit with Erdogan. The two of them, again, look at those images, all smiles. Fabrice Potier, is Joe Biden inevitably the star of the show at any NATO summit because the president of the United States, because of the United States is 70% of NATO's budget? Or in this case, has Erdogan kind of stolen his thunder here?
I think Erdogan is having the time of his life in the sense that he's exactly in the kind of role he enjoys, which is he's the indispensable deal maker and deal breaker. And it goes on for Ukraine, but it also actually used to be a key for Syria. And in a way, it's also key for the US posture in southeastern Europe. So, and Erdogan, actually, you were talking about pivot. I think it's not a 190-degree pivot with Erdogan. It's 380-degree, which means he goes all around and goes where the interest of the moment, so it's very transactional, will offer him opportunities. Like on the grain deal, he's indispensable. He's even going as far as the previous guest of yours was saying, as willing to defend the opening of the grain export route.
You believe that could happen?
Russian warship. No, but I think the rhetoric is interesting. However, I think what is also interesting is Turkey's economy and food transformation sector is benefiting from Ukrainian cereal arriving in Turkish ports and being transformed in Turkish factories. So there's always some business behind politics and always some politics behind business with Erdogan.
Yeah, Melinda Herring, the United States too can be transactional, with Erdogan saying there's not going to be a final green light on Sweden's entry until October. The U.S., of course, when it promises F-16 fighter jets, now has to send that to Congress. So what's the likelihood of those jets being green lighted?
I think that's likely to happen. On the Black Sea grain question that we're watching on Monday, I spoke with some Ukrainian Black Sea traders, and they said that so far Turkey is not doing anything. The biggest of the three ports that is blocked has been blocked for 2+ months, and they don't see any action. So on the Ukrainian side, there's not a lot of optimism that this Black Sea grain deal is going to be reinstated.
Borza Dargahi, do you think it's serious that Turkey, at a push, would patrol alongside Ukrainian grain vessels?
I mean, I think it's an important possibility. I mean, this is a dream for Turkey in a way. As previous analysts have pointed out, Erdogan gets to be this kind of pivotal deal maker and breaker in Ukraine, but also, the sort of fantasy of who controls the Black Sea, which is one of the very real worries that Turkey had when this war began. Is this going to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake? And this is one of the other reasons why Turkey has this long-standing kind of factory reset type partnership with Ukraine, because they both have an interest in seeing Russia not control the Black Sea. This is a strategic goal that goes back centuries.
It goes back centuries. Now we're just days away, Borzu, from the grain deal expiring. After this NATO summit, how's it looking?
I mean, I really, it's really tough to know what's going to happen. Will Turkey just go ahead and export grain without Russian approval? Will it escort ships? Yeah, they've done things like that before. But, you know, again, I have a feeling that at the last minute, Russia will accede and not put itself in a position where it will have to either show itself as being very weak or take escalatory measures.
Fabrice Potet, you told us a moment ago when it came to Turkey to follow the money. The same can be said for Russia. We've heard it so many times, them talking about breaking this deal, which, by the way, is so important for many of our viewers watching us in places like Africa. And in the end, the Russians need the hard currency too.
Yes, but Russia also enjoy putting the blame on Ukraine and the West in the global South and painting Ukraine as the source of starvation and the source of high food prices. So in this sense here, Russia is choosing the kind of politics and disinformation against indeed their need for cash. And this is obviously frustrating. But what you are seeing also is that Ukraine has really learned some lessons about how to better engage with the global South. And you have seen the beginning of a meeting that could lead to a new summit, a peace summit with some global South leaders and the Ukrainians and some G7 leaders around the Zelensky peace formula. And I think this is, you know, not to be taken in a light way, in the sense that this is really a Ukrainian genuine attempt to bring Brazil, South Africa, India, and the many others on their side and not on the side of the invader.
In the meantime, though, Yves Bertoncini, a economic summit in St. Petersburg is still planned for the end of the month between Russia and African states. How do you see that going down?
Yeah, that's probably one of the theater where Russia is playing the cards it has. I mean, Africa, what is called the global South.
Can they play business as usual after all that's transpired in the recent months, particularly after what we saw at the end of June with that wavering?
Normally not, but you know, this is based on. I mean, Russia is weaker and weaker, but at least it can rely on, you know, a common, let's say, critical position vis-à-vis the West. I would say it this way. And in Africa, we know that given the history we have had, I mean, there are some negative emotion vis-à-vis former colonial powers. And in this war, yes, it has been said there's a narrative conflict, putting the blame on Ukraine, for example, for the fact that the grains are not properly exported. Well, this has to be counterfought, and I mean, it has to be said that, of course, it's not because of this, and it has to be fixed. And this is more important, and Turkey's role will be crucial, because, of course, the African, they can have an image of the West, which is not that positive for obvious reasons, but very pragmatically, if we can move into the right direction to maintain the export of grains, this will change things on the ground, I would say. And the same is true, by the way, I wanted to add this, militarily for Ukraine, because even if Ukraine is not in NATO, I mean, Israel is not in NATO, as long as we can help Ukraine properly, that we will remember next July for the next NATO summit, what has happened on the ground, if the weapons have been delivered or not, if Ukraine's counter-offensive have produced fruits. I mean, and I mean, we'll see, and that will be decisive. It's also a matter of time, maybe weeks, and the same is true for the grains. And I think the rest of the world will look at that, and they look at the results. There is a narrative aspect, but of course, what is more important, it was happened, because the narrative can collapse if you see that Russian soldiers are defeated, and if you see that the grains are still exported as there should be, because there is a need in Turkey, elsewhere, in Africa, everywhere, to have such grains, given the strategic position of Ukraine and Russia, Belarus, in the production of grains. Yes, sure.
French President Emmanuel Macron leaving that Vilnius summit asserting that Russia is, quote, militarily fragile. That's not the way they're spinning it in Moscow, of course, where the Russians fancy their chances defending against a Ukrainian counteroffensive that's come up against mines, trenches, the greater Russian manpower. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, he'd been the target of Yevgeny Prigozhin's wrath on June 24th. He's back in the public eye with a bit of bravado.
В целом ни на одном из направлений противник.
The enemy hasn't achieved its goals in any direction. We are continuing to launch efficient strikes with long-range, high-precision weapons on the Ukrainian military reserves and the weapons delivered by the West, reducing the enemy's offensive potential.
Потенциал противника.
Melinda Herring, it is easier to play defense than offense. Right now it's Ukraine that has to be on the offensive.
Yeah, I wanted to push back a little bit. I don't think we're going to look back on this NATO summit as a great success. Like the previous analyst said, all eyes are on the counteroffensive, but Ukraine is making very slow progress because of mines. It depends on which axis you're looking at, but in some places in Zaporizhia Oblast, there's 3 layers of mines,
Yes.
and it's very, very difficult to push forward. Ukraine also doesn't have the air power it needs. General Zaluzhny just wrote a very powerful piece, and he said, NATO, I need an air force. If you look at any of your military doctrines, you would not attempt a complicated counteroffensive like this without air power. So yes, maybe we'll look back a year from now and say, look how much progress Ukraine has made. But unless we give them the air force, the demining equipment they need, the air defense that they need, and also the long-range missiles that they need that the White House refuses to give, I don't think we're going to look back and pat ourselves on the back a year from now.
Those storm shadows, those French scalps, as they're called, because they're made by the French and the British, it's the same ones, which have a sort of a less of a long range. Are those the solution, Melinda?
So the Brits have sent those, and yes, those are fantastic. They aren't quite as long as the American equivalent, but there aren't enough of them. If the Americans were to send ATACMS, it would enable Ukraine to be able to hit more targets in Crimea and hit behind enemy lines. And Zaluzhny and the military have been begging for ATACMS, but the White House refuses to send them.
Fabrice Potier, should they send them?
I think there's a bigger question here, which is why are we managing a war where we understand the adversary, and I think the adversary is pretty clear about the kind of tactics he's willing to use, and why are we managing this with 3-month cycles? Every 3 or 4 months, we have a new decision cycle where basically we respond to the previous 3 or 6 month escalation. And it's deeply frustrating, first for Zaluzhny, also for Zelensky, and for the millions of Ukrainian people. And I think what we're trying to fix here, and this is something Melinda mentioned earlier, is on the sideline of the NATO summit. I think you had probably the best deliverable as far as Ukraine is concerned, which is this joint declaration on security guarantees. And here the idea is to codify and make permanent what we've been doing under the Rammstein format, and make sure basically Ukrainians have everything it takes for them to defend the territory and get success. So I think I'm optimistic that indeed I agree with the previous guest that the best strategy is still success in the battlefield. But to have success in the battlefield, you need to have real political commitment that the Ukrainians will get the kind of capabilities, air combat power, long-range missiles that they need to actually really push back on the Russians. And I think we're getting there, but it's still always too incremental and too cyclical. And I think the joint declaration is going to fix that.
Fabrice, the adage, loose lips sink ships, there's probably, again, there's more going on than meets the eye. I mean, they're not sending these pilots off to be trained for nothing, right? So the airplanes are coming. When?
Exactly, but when means, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers being injured and being killed. Yeah. That's the problem. And we are still in a race against the clock. And this is what the Russians are still betting, that they have enough strategic depth, that they can throw enough men at the problem to hold. Whilst, of course, the Ukrainians have the will, have the motivation. They are defending their territory and their nation. But they also obviously have a smaller population. So I think this is about us being smarter and in a way providing things to accelerate the clock in favor of the Ukrainians.
Yves
Yeah,
Bertoncini?
I totally agree with this. That's has been said. NATO Summit can accelerate some decisions. You know, you've mentioned French decisions to send missiles. Norway has done the same. But what is more important is Ramstein-style meetings. Indeed,
Meeting
delivering
between defense ministers.
absolutely and delivering weapons. And I agree with the fact that we should do more and more. So to help Ukraine to win this counteroffensive, which is indeed
So
a
why
very
are we still
difficult one.
thinking in 3-month increments, as Fabrice puts it?
Yeah, I think, well, what Joe Biden has said in his quite inspiring speech in Vilnius is that, well, you know, Putin underestimated us. He thought we would not react. He thought maybe I was Sleepy Joe. I mean, it's not Biden's expression, but it was not Sleepy Joe. Yes, there was. So the Russians, they were totally wrong in the fact that Ukraine was not a people able to react, but the Russians were wrong as well in thinking that the Westerners would not react. Now they are fighting against us because it's consistent with Putin's vision of the fact that we don't like Putin, we don't like Russia, we're the enemies. But since we are not the enemies, but we are fighting against Russia, yes, we should deliver more. I think, to answer your question, well, at the beginning there was no much trust in Ukraine's ability to win this war. It has, in particular in France, at the highest level. Now there's the idea that we should defeat Russia, but maybe not too much, and we should give missiles, but not missiles to be sent to Moscow, because what is the interest of the Europeans and Americans, maybe, is to have a conflict where at the end Russia is defeated, but where Ukraine has won the war, but maybe not a total defeat, you know, a massive defeat and humiliation of Russia. To me, it would be fine. But I mean, at the highest level, I suspect that it's more based on realpolitik, and so they're rather in favor of, yes, a counteroffensive and then delivering weapons progressively to keep control on the dynamics of the war.
Borzo Dargahi, could it have gone another way?
I mean, that's a really tough question to ask me. Could it have gone another way? You know, there's been, as people have pointing out, these cycles where we have these incredible debates about, should we send this? Should we send tanks? Should we send, you know, fighter jets and so on? And, you know, it has been said by a number of analysts who are better steeped at this, that if there had been a, you know, kind of an executive level decision on the part of Western media leaders, Western military leaders rather, to flood the zone, as it were, with these instruments such as tanks and fighter jets, much earlier on, there would be a better situation for the Ukrainians right now, and an ultimate end to the war would be sooner, and that would help save both Ukrainian and Russian lives.
And right now, looking ahead, Vladimir Putin, if his goal is simply to lay the east of Ukraine to waste, is it mission accomplished?
His goal is, I think, that he's hoping that the 2024 U.S. elections are going to save his skin, so to speak. So, I mean, I think that's going to be something to watch. He's hoping that Donald Trump or, Ron DeSantis or one of those people takes over in the U.S., and that will be basically solving his problems for him.
We'll have to leave it there. So much more to talk about. Borzo Dargahi, thank you so much for joining us from Istanbul. I want to thank Melinda Herring in Washington, Fabrice Potier in Madrid, Yves Bertoncini. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.